Paris in the winter of 1943. The city had a curfew, a set of masters it had not chosen, and a silence that pressed against every window after dark. Inside a crowded music hall near the Grand Boulevards, the air was warm with cigarette smoke and the nervous breath of a full house. In the front rows sat uniformed men, officers of the occupying army, their caps resting on their knees, their faces lit gold by the footlights. Behind them, ordinary Parisians pressed into narrow seats, careful with their eyes, careful with their hands, careful with everything. And then a slim man in a light suit walked out from the wings, a small blue cornflower pinned to his lapel, and he was smiling. His name was Charles Trenet. He looked at the officers in the front row the same way he looked at the grandmother in the back, and he did not stop smiling. Everyone in that hall understood the arithmetic of the moment. A wrong word, a wrong song, a wrong glance could end a career, or worse. Trenet knew it too, and in the few seconds before the orchestra began, he made a decision that no one in that room was expecting. He would not sing about fear. He would sing about the sea, the sun, and a kind of freedom that no one in that theater was allowed to say out loud. By 1943, Charles Trenet was already one of the most beloved voices in France. They called him Le Fou Chantant, the singing fool, for the way he seemed to bounce across a stage, tossing his hat, letting joy spill out of him as if it cost nothing. But joy, in an occupied country, was a complicated thing to sell. Trenet had built his fame on songs about sunshine, about gardens, about the small, ordinary happiness of being alive on a bright day. Now that same happiness could be read two ways. To the men in the front row, a cheerful song was proof that Paris was fine, that the arrangement was working. To the Parisians in the cheap seats, the same song could be a small act of defiance, a reminder that the sun still rose, that the country underneath the occupation was still there, still theirs. Trenet lived in that double meaning every single night. He was watched, questioned, and pressured, like every famous artist of his moment. Some whispered that he was too comfortable, that he sang too easily for the wrong audience. Others believed the opposite, that his stubborn brightness was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to let the occupiers turn France into a nation of frightened, silent people. What almost no one saw was the cost of that brightness. Every night he had to walk out and be joy itself for a country that had very little to be joyful about, and then carry that performance home with him into the dark, blacked-out streets. He had grown up near the Mediterranean, in the sun of the French South, and something of that light had never left him. It was the thing he gave away every evening, whether the room deserved it or not. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either side wanted to admit. Trenet was not a soldier. He carried no weapon. But he had a voice that an entire country trusted, and that winter he was about to decide what to do with it. To understand what that smile cost, you have to understand what Paris had become. For more than 3 years, the city that once called itself the capital of light had lived under occupation. There were foreign signs on French streets, ration cards for bread, and a nightly darkness broken only by the blue-shaded lamps the authorities allowed. And yet, strangely, the theaters stayed open. The cabarets, the music halls, the little cellar clubs of Montmartre and the Left Bank filled every night. People needed somewhere to go where the war was not the only subject in the room. Music became a kind of shelter. For 2 hours in a dark hall, a shopgirl could forget the queue she had stood in, and a father could forget the son he had not heard from. But the shelter had walls, and the walls had rules. Every song was reviewed, every lyric could be examined. Performers who said too much, who mocked the wrong men or praised the wrong flag, simply disappeared from the posters. The occupiers loved French entertainment. They filled the best seats and applauded the loudest. They wanted Paris to keep singing, because a singing city looked like a contented one. The performers understood the trap. To go on stage at all was to be useful to someone. The only question that remained was what you did with the 3 minutes when the lights were on you. That was the narrow space where a man like Charles Trenet had to decide who he was going to be. The evening had started safely enough. Trenet opened with the songs the crowd expected, the light, dancing numbers that made even the officers tap their polished boots. He tossed his hat. He grinned. He let that famous brightness fill the hall. And for a while, the room relaxed into the comfortable illusion that this was just an ordinary night of entertainment. But those who knew him well could feel something gathering under the smile. Between songs, he glanced toward the wings, where the orchestra leader waited for the signal. There was a piece Trenet had been carrying with him, a melody about the sea. It was not a protest song. It named no enemy. It made no speech. On paper, it was almost absurdly innocent. Waves, silver reflections, the endless blue horizon along the French coast. And that was exactly why it was so dangerous. Because in a country that had lost the right to move freely, in a city where you could not travel to your own sea without permission, a song about the open water was a song about everything the occupation had taken. Freedom, distance, the horizon that did not belong to any army. He had carried this melody for a long time, humming it to himself in trains and dressing rooms, turning it over like a stone worn smooth by the sea it described. It was, in a way, the most honest thing he had ever made, because it asked for nothing and accused no one. And yet it held the whole memory of a free coast inside 3 simple minutes. Trenet felt the moment approaching, the way a swimmer feels the pull of the tide. He could stay in the shallow, safe songs, or he could step into the deep water in front of the very men who had drawn the borders. The orchestra fell quiet. He nodded to the conductor, and the room began to change. He was not the only great voice moving through those halls. In the same season, in the same threatened city, a small woman in a plain black dress was singing her own dangerous songs a few streets away. Edith Piaf was already a legend of the Paris stage, and she too performed for audiences that included the occupiers. Like Trenet, she learned to survive inside the double meaning, to give the men in the front row a beautiful evening while giving her own people something else entirely, something they could carry home in their chests. The two of them belonged to the same fragile world, artists who had become far too famous to disappear quietly and far too watched to speak plainly. They understood, better than anyone, the price of a single wrong night. Around them stood the machinery of control. There were censors who read every lyric. There were officials who decided which artists toured, which recorded, which were simply erased. And there were the officers themselves, sitting in the good seats, deciding in real time whether they were being flattered or mocked. For a performer, the stakes were not abstract. A song judged insulting could mean the loss of the stage, the loss of income, an interrogation, a name on a list. Careers ended in a single evening. So when Charles Trenet walked out that winter night and looked at the uniforms in the front row, he was not being reckless. He knew exactly what game he was inside. He simply refused to play it the way they wanted. What happened next was the kind of thing that people would still describe decades later in quiet voices as if it had been a small miracle. As Trenet's voice carried the melody higher, something shifted in the room. The Parisians in the back had gone completely still. Some of them were crying, though they tried to hide it, dabbing at their eyes as if the smoke had gotten to them. A song about the sea had reached into a crowd of occupied, frightened, rationed people and reminded them all at once of who they were before the war. The footlights glowed amber across the stage. Trenet's slim figure swayed gently, his arms open, his whole body given over to the music. For 3 minutes, the theater was no longer a place of front rows and back rows, of occupiers and occupied. It was just a room full of French hearts, listening to their own coastline being sung back to them. The officers applauded. Of course they did. They had heard a lovely song. But the people behind them were applauding something else entirely, and everyone who understood knew it. Trenet stood in the golden light and accepted both sets of applause with the same smile, giving each side exactly what it thought it was hearing. It was defiance disguised as tenderness. It was freedom smuggled inside a melody. And no one in that hall, not the officers, not the censors, not even the other performers waiting in the wings, could do a single thing to stop it. Because on paper, nothing forbidden had happened at all. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Trenet stood at the front of the stage, the small blue flower still on his lapel, and he let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. The officers in the front row looked up. The Parisians in the back leaned forward. Then, very softly, the first notes of the melody drifted out, a gentle, rocking rhythm, like water moving under moonlight. And Charles Trenet began to sing about the sea. He did not sing it as a challenge. That was the genius of the choice. He sang it the way a man sings when he is remembering something beautiful and slightly out of reach. Tenderly, almost dreamily, his eyes half closed, his voice rising and falling with the imagined waves. To the officers, it was a pretty song, a postcard, a charming Frenchman being charming. But to the men and women in the cheaper seats, every line landed somewhere deeper. They heard the coastline they could no longer reach. They heard the freedom of the open horizon. They heard a country that still existed underneath the flags and the checkpoints. No one dared to say it, but you could feel it moving through the hall like a current, a shared, silent understanding that this gentle little song about the water was, quietly, about all of them. Trenet had made his choice. He had walked to the edge of what was allowed, smiled, and stepped over it, using nothing more dangerous than the sea. The song did not end the war. No single evening could. The occupation would grind on, and the men in the front rows would keep their good seats for a while longer. But something had been proven in that hall, quietly and completely. The melody Trenet sang that night would go on to become one of the most beloved French songs ever written. A piece about the sea that would travel the world, be recorded in 100 languages, and outlive every uniform in that front row. People would hum it for generations without ever knowing that it was first offered up in a room full of occupiers as a small, smiling act of courage. And Charles Trenet, the singing fool, the man in the light suit with the flower on his lapel, would carry that night with him for the rest of his long life. He never pretended to be a hero. He was a singer, not a soldier. In the years that followed, when people asked him about the war, he rarely spoke of nights like this one. He preferred to let the song do the remembering. Perhaps he understood that a melody outlasts a testimony, that a tune a whole country hums will keep a memory alive long after the last witness is gone. But that winter, in front of the very men who ruled his city, he refused to be afraid. And he did it the only way he knew how, with a smile, a melody, and the wide blue horizon of the sea. That is the part history almost forgot. Not a speech, not a weapon, just a song about the water, sung to a room that was not allowed to feel free, by a man who decided that for 3 minutes they would feel it anyway. And somewhere beyond the blacked-out city, the sea kept moving, exactly as he had promised, silver, endless, and belonging to no one but the people who dared to remember it.